have people dedicated to inventing batteries for evaluation. So we tend to grab on to whatever is out there. And a lot of us in the class were kind of dissatisfied with what we had, and we feel like we sort of cycle through new trends. It's just like, what's the trend of the year that we're going to use this year and see how it fits. And none of them really fit quite right because they weren't designed for libraries and they're just modifications. So I said, well, what about churches? And it kind of took off from there. So I decided to look at the library as a sacred place and see if this could be a relevant way of looking at measurement and evaluation for academic libraries in particular. And I do think that this applies really only to academic libraries, since public libraries are sort of a different thing entirely, and I'll get a little bit more into that. I should preface this by saying that some of you may have read a book called Sacred Stacks by Nancy Maxwell. She's doing something very different there. Her book is more of a treatise on the worth and usefulness of librarians as a profession. She compares librarians to priests. She talks about us being in these sort of cathedrals of knowledge. But it's much more about, like, yes, we're valid and we're useful and we have this really like trusted position, and not much at all about practical applications of that. So she really doesn't delve into that. Okay, so the core analogy is the academic library is to the university, and I put that in quotes, as the church is to God. So if we kind of conceptualize the university and God as these very nebulous abstract concepts, that's what we're going with. Both the academic library and church serve as tangible conduits to abstract goals. I want to get salvation. I want to get closer to God, so I go to church, because that's a vehicle for me doing that here on earth. It's a very abstract thing to reach. We all have different ideas of what that means. Different religions have different ideas, but there is some commonality in most religions have some sorts of rituals. They have spaces. They have vehicles for attaining certain things. The academic library also has abstract goals because it serves the mission of the university. And get a little bit more into that in a bit, but those tend to be really, really vague and sort of nice concepts like knowledge and justice, truth. These aren't really things that are very tangible or palpable, but the academic library is supposed to be supporting that mission. And I think this is more relevant than the corporate analogy, because ultimately corporate measures of efficacy do have to deal with profit. I mean, there is a bottom line. And academic libraries are not for profit. So we need to see how that might skew those measures when we try to apply them to the academic library. Customer satisfaction with the goal of making more money is different than customer satisfaction with the goal of providing an abstract sort of service. Okay, so we're going to make some critical assumptions here, and you'll have to bear with me, but I think they do play out. My first assumption being that the current the models of efficacy don't really cut it. They rely very heavily on things like circulation stats, use statistics, customer satisfaction. So you ask a bunch of undergrads if they like the library, do they like the space they're in, do they find the librarians helpful? None of those are bad things to be asking, but they don't present the whole picture. And so if we're talking about remodeling a library or changing the academic library to meet the needs of undergrads, we need to make sure that we're asking them all of the relevant questions, and we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater trying to meet a need when we haven't even looked at a whole series of needs they might have. This proposed framework offers some new methods because it's going to pull in a lot more affective batteries. And its primary goal is to examine the continued importance of the traditional library. Of great concern to me is the shift towards basically glorified student unions, spaces with lots of computers, lots of food. Nothing's wrong with either of those things, but you do have libraries moving farther and farther away from stacks and circulation desks and card catalogs, and are we losing something if we get rid of those things, even if the use statistics aren't saying that we need to keep them in the room? And customer satisfaction does not present a full picture, and I'll go into that more. So why look to the psychology of religion instead of looking at other models? There is a similarity, and I think it's a valid one. You've got inherently abstract goals for the university and for religion. So you have something more comparable than corporate goals, which are very tangible, which are profit, which are user statistics. Missions and goals are very abstract. I did a survey of a couple hundred college mottos, and it's amazing how many times their mottos include words like truth, knowledge, wisdom. And mission statements tend to be just more verbose and kind of lengthy encapsulations of those same concepts. They're dedicated to the missions of providing knowledge and turning out great citizens to the world, that type of thing. Those are not easy things to quantify, and that's what we're trying to do, is the library contributing to those missions. One reason that I think psychology of religion is a good field to look into is because it's not a new field. It's been alive and vibrant for a very long time. And there's been a lot of empirical research that's been done over the course of the last 40 years to develop batteries and methodologies for looking at the efficacy of churches, the efficacy of religious rites, the efficacy of iconographic things. The church has been really, really well studied as place. And I know that the whole idea of library as place has become very much in vogue because we don't really know what that means anymore. And people have very heated opinions about what that should look like and whether it should look like the sort of Gothic building with big stacks and keep the old, or whether we should be moving towards these very like open, modern information commons types of buildings. But we don't have a lot of research into what the old library as place was or what the new library as place is, but we toss around this term a lot, library as place. Also, the psychology of religion looks a lot at affective measures. That's not something that we've done well in library science. Customer satisfaction is not the same as an affective measure. Asking somebody if they like the library is very different than asking somebody how they felt while they were studying in the library. Those may not be the same things. And I think it also has a more complex and kind of nuanced world of measurement than libraries do right now. Also, we have this unexplained library data. So a lot of research has been done into undergraduates in particular use of the library. Antel and Engel did a really nice study looking at the use of the library. I believe it was Oklahoma State University, and they covered undergrads, grad students, and faculty because everybody's a stakeholder in an academic library. And they kind of went the typical route. They asked people, you know, how often do you use the library? Are you able to find what you need? Those kinds of questions. But they also had some filler questions that they got some kind of unexpected responses to. Most notably, they had a lot of people using the library as a space that weren't using any of the materials in the library. So you had people that were going there to study, but they had no reason to be studying there per se. They weren't checking out books, they weren't using the computers, they weren't using the databases, but they were reporting that this was the place that they felt most conducive to scholarship. This was where they wanted to sit if they had to buckle down and write a paper. It was where they wanted to sit if they needed to really learn. They didn't go any farther with that at all. They just kind of put it as a side note in this study as like well, we really don't know what to make of this. We weren't expecting this at all. But they had a pretty overwhelming response, especially from undergraduates, which is even more surprising. These are the kids that we're thinking of as being, they're so wired. They don't want the stacks. They don't want, but they're going in there to study. We need to figure out why that is and how we support that, and if we lose something and make it not hospitable to them if we get rid of those spaces. That's not the only study where that's come up. It has come up as a secondary finding in a lot of sort of overviews of how the library is performing, usually with undergraduates, and I think that's particularly interesting because those are the kids we're supposedly changing things for. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about sanctification of objects. In the psychology of religion, this concept of sanctification is really important because sanctified objects have really powerful affective benefits for people. And I should point out that a sanctified object does not necessarily have to be a religious object. It's just an object or a place that's set aside for a dedicated use that is meaningful to the user. So a church obviously has that kind of sanctification. Other spaces that they looked at that were not churches, for example, were things like grottos or shrines, outdoor spaces that are significant to people. For example, like indigenous people sometimes will have areas that are, I mean, there's no building there, but it's meaningful to them for various reasons. And it's dedicated for certain dances or for certain rituals. Objects that have been sanctified by people, the research shows, have much more profound impacts on them. They view them as being more useful, more beneficial. They're willing to invest time and money into them. And people derive benefits simply by being in the presence of these objects. So there's been some studies looking at like iconographic things, so statues in religious spaces, for example. And people have overwhelmingly had positive psychological benefit just by being around them, even if they're not using them. What's sacred about the academic library? Well, it's a dedicated space. What we're dedicated to is, again, this sort of abstract idea of knowledge. There's also a sort of universality of what the academic library looks like. You expect certain things. You expect stacks. You expect a circulation desk. You expect study carols. You expect a book drop. You expect card catalogs. The card catalogs obviously are kind of going out, but if you ask people for things you associate with an academic library, books, card catalogs, that type of thing is going to come up. And there's ritualistic aspects to library use. Again, that's been much studied. Different user behavior models show that people have really different strategies that are individual, but they tend to stick to that same strategy that works for them every time they go to the library. So for one person, maybe it's they hit the database first and then they head up to the third floor to grab what they need from the stacks and they go to their favorite study carrel. For another person, it's asking someone at the reference desk for help, getting what they need and setting up on a table and spreading out. But people tend to do the same thing every time, and they tend to be creatures of habit. Also, there's the concept of familiarity and security that also attaches to a library. But a church is like this as well, and it's also been really studied. So for example, somebody that is a Roman Catholic maybe is out of town, but they can go to another Catholic church in a time of crisis, and they count on sort of like-minded people that are there to help them. They count on sort of the sameness to the Mass, to the things that they see around them. It feels like home. Much as somebody that's Jewish would feel going into a temple in another place, they know that they can find a rabbi there. They know that they can find certain objects. There is something that grounds them. Academic libraries are sort of the same. If you are looking for that space, you know you can find a place with books. But is that changing? So can we view the library through this lens? I think we can. And there's been much made of the support convoy, and I'd like to think that librarians are kind of the same. That even if we're not being used as much at the reference desk, there's some sort of feeling like I have support for my scholarly endeavor in this space. And then there's also been a lot of research done on personal strivings. And personal strivings are the goals that people seek in everyday behavior. And basically why this is relevant is that with things that are sanctified strivings, people get much better benefit and they invest much more in doing them. And sanctified strivings in research have come up being things like maintaining a marriage, pursuing an education, bettering themselves, finding a good job. More than just like getting my bills paid. That would be not a sanctified striving. So the possible intersection. We have research saying that we've got this sort of unexplained idea of sanctuary in the academic library. Can we show the clear correlation between the library and the achievement of university goals and missions? I mean, the biggest thing is we want to keep ourselves relevant on campus. When we ask for budget, we need to be able to say this is why we need it. We are relevant. We're being used. Maybe we're not being used in the way that we're examining, though. So if our user statistics are down, then let's look at why that is. Maybe the circulation stats aren't painting the whole picture. And how can we apply it? We can design batteries to look at this. And I propose drawing pretty heavily on the existing measures in psychology of religion and examining whether we lose something if we shift away from all those objects that we used to believe should be in the library that we're getting rid of gradually. And there's a few ways to do this. There's modifying existing site questionnaires and using the ones that they already have. There's the Santa Clara questionnaire that seems to lend itself pretty well. Also, analyzing the affect of students in a very traditional setting versus a very modern information comment, and just kind of seeing whether there's any disconnect. If the ones in the traditional setting are getting more, if they feel more focused, for example, than the information comments, would be one way to go about it. And the other thing would be to use a site battery that uses vignette style affective batteries, so it paints a picture. That way you're not bringing in as many variables as if you do something comparative, because if you choose the wrong libraries, one might have really crummy reference staff, the other might have great, and that might make a difference in how people feel in that space. One may have comfortable chairs, the other may not. It's hard to control for that, so a vignette style is pretty well accepted, and it might be a way to look at it. And why does it matter? And I think it's because we need to keep ourselves viable. At some point, if we look like a coffee shop and computer lab, is the university going to say, why are we giving you guys so much space and budget? You look just like the union. That's a scary thought to me. So I think we need to distance ourselves on some level and set ourselves apart in a way, because if we are just doing an electronic forum for people, I'm not sure that we can keep saying, well, we are different somehow. And that comes out in very tangible ways when we get cuts in budget, and everybody's struggling with that right now. So I think this is a pretty critical issue for sustainability. And it's also, you want your shareholders to invest. So, yeah. That's it, if there's any questions or comments.
Yes.
Have you ever done a survey of the students and asked them, because I know I'm an English lit major and I love books, and the fact that everything is going so digital, I have a friend who's an engineer who's like, I had never been in a library ever. And it's just interesting, have you done like statistical data of the students?
I haven't yet, and I'm planning to pilot something in the spring, and I'm working on it now. There's been a lot done about, like if you just look at user surveys, and what you're pointing out is pretty in line with that. The more science majory
The more they want
types are not in the space as much, whereas the liberal arts and humanities people are. Interestingly enough, the Antel and Engel study, that didn't bear out for the faculty. So there may be, that may be something where the younger users, there is something different going on. But there were exceptions as well. So, but I think generally speaking, the less paper intensive subjects, yeah, they don't go into this space as much because they don't really need to. And they haven't had that exposure. So, I mean, that also brings in questions of like getting people in for mandatory freshman courses for user instruction and bringing them into the library and kind of demoing it for them to see if they'll come back.
I just don't know very much about this. You're talking about business models and looking at circulation as a statistic. Do they actually look at the number of people who come in?
Yeah, gate counts are another really common. And that's one of those things where it's, they have gate counts go up, but the circ stats go down. And so then it puts us in kind of a crunch for budget sometime, because it's like, well, yeah, people are coming through, but they're not checking out books. So it must mean that they don't need books. It's just the electronic. And that's been one of the big stats that people use, because like circulation per head has gone down, even though the gate counts really haven't for most places. And so it's been one of those budget things that's killed us, where people have said like, well, then we don't need to develop the paper collection anymore. Like the hard copy, this is why we're going to cut serials, because no one's using them. We just will do the electronic. So yeah, that's been one of those kind of double-edged swords, where the gate counts went up, but then that stack gets flipped against us when it comes time for budget allotment. So.
And it's always attributed to the fact that people are not actually putting their hands on books.
Basically, and that's also a deceptive stat, because people go into the stacks, pull something, and don't take it home. So it's really hard. People try to track that at some places, and that's like RFID is one of the things that people are thinking will be more useful for that, because you can scan a set of stacks really quickly. But then there's privacy issues, people don't want to bring that in. But some libraries do have stack counts where they'll go before cleanup and just check to see how much was missing off of the shelf, and they'll count that as a separate SIRLS stat. But a lot of people don't have the staff to do that regularly, so it's like a once a month kind of thing for one section of the stacks, and you're not really presenting a full picture.
So you think more could be done in, like, with the aesthetics of libraries? Is that?
Well, I think my concern is less about the aesthetics of it and more about we need to make really sure that we're not losing something critical when we go to get rid of stuff. Because there are libraries that are moving their stacks off campus in huge volume amount and minimizing space, and they're consolidating. So now you're having 6 floors total for all libraries on a campus as opposed to 6 buildings because the stacks have been moved off-site. Do we lose something by getting rid of the stacks? Even if people don't check out those books very often and don't need to go pull them, and it's a minor inconvenience when they do we lose something by not having that dedicated space that's quiet and familiar and looks like a library for people to go pull away in? And I think that's the kind of thing that we need to examine before we start kind of tossing everything out, because we've decided sort of arbitrarily people like computers better. They may like computers better, but it doesn't mean that they're not getting something really beneficial out of this space, even if they're not using it in the way it was intended. So I think that's more where I come in, because I don't have much background in architecture or aesthetics, but in those tangible objects, I think that's what we need to look at.
Okay, that makes sense.
In the church literature that, actually I saw something on the news this week about a lot of Catholic churches going back to the Latin masses. Is that like a big thing in the church literature right now, that bringing ritual?
Well, ritual and also traditional spaces. There was a really interesting study done on storefront churches and how the benefit people get from the sort of strip mall churches that are in small spaces. They report much lower benefit than when they go to a church of the same denomination that's in a dedicated space for it. So there is something to, like, the idea of, like, if it looks like the real deal, people buy into it more and get more out of it. And I think that that's where a lot of the ritual stuff comes in as well, is that you move away to something that's more mainstream and you get modern music and you get all of this stuff, and that's appealing and it may bring people in, but they may walk away kind of half satisfied because it's not what they expect out of church. It's not different enough. And so there's been, people are really into doing research on that right now in that field, for sure.
Wonderful. Very interesting. Any more questions? Thank you so much. It was a wonderful talk.